you, my wife can't do nothing right. She can't cook, the worst cook in the world. Gave my kid alphabet soup. He spelled out help. What a lousy cook. I mean, how can toast have bones? She's a lousy cook, too. She can't cook at all. I leave dental floss in the kitchen, the roaches hang themselves. And I tell you, my wife, she can't cook either. My house, we pray after we eat. I bought a pressure cooker. Now I eat off the ceiling. What a lousy cook. I don't think meatloaf should glow in the dark. I mean, if she can't cook at all, my backyard, the flies chipped in to fix the screen door. I tell you, my wife with eating, there's always problems. She's a strict vegetarian. In fact, when I met her, she was grazing on the front lawn. I mean, she can't cook at all. She made chocolate mousse and antler got stuck in my throat.
Good morning. It is Tuesday, March the 14th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have Tucker-Carlson, emotional manipulation, the rape of the mind, and Breaking Bad. All that and more when we get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now, No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
A society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both. Underlying most arguments against the free market is a lack of belief in freedom itself. Milton Friedman. This chicken or egg discussion is addressed perfectly by Milton Friedman. Subordinating freedom to equality means, by definition, the attempt of a disinterested third party, government, to effect a social result by some form of coercion. Equality, or any other social result, can only come about sustainably from an environment of freedom. Coercion cannot create equality, only the appearance of a temporary equality. If one truly believes in freedom, they must believe in freedom as the precursor to other social aims.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind, the urge to be conditioned.
The urge to be conditioned. One suggestion this chapter is not intended to convey is that Pavlovian conditioning as such is something wrong. This kind of conditioning occurs everywhere where people are together in common interaction. The speaker influences the listener, but the listener also the speaker. Through the process of conditioning, people often learn to like and do what they are allowed to like and do. The more isolated the group, the stricter the conditioning that takes place in those belonging to the group. In some groups, one finds people more capable than others of conveying suggestion and bringing about conditioning. Gradually, one can discern the stronger ones, the better adjusted ones, the more experienced ones, and the noisier ones, whose ability to condition others is strongest. Every group, every club, every society has its leading Pavlovian bell. This kind of person imprints his inner bell ringing on others. He can even develop a system of monolithic bell ringing. No other influential bell is allowed to compete with him. Another subtle question belongs to these problems. Why is there in us so great an urge to be conditioned? The urge to learn, to imitate, to conform, and to follow the pattern of family and group. This urge to be conditioned, to submit to the communal pattern and the family pattern must be related to man's dependency on parents and fellow men. Animals are not so dependent on one another. In the whole animal kingdom, man is one of the most helpless and naked beings. He remains like a monkey fetus. He never grows into a mature, hairy, fully covered state. In his persistent fetal state, he remains dependent on maternal care and paternal teaching and conditioning. But among the animals, man has, relatively, the longest youth and time for learning. At least, this is what Louis Bolk's fetalization theory tells us about man's retarded state and never-ending social dependency. Puzzlement and doubt, which inevitably arise in the training process, are the beginnings of mental freedom. Of course, the initial puzzlement of doubt is not enough. Behind that, there has to be faith in our democratic freedoms and the will to fight for it. I hope to come back to this central problem of faith and moral freedom as differentiated from conditioned loyalty and servitude in the last chapter. Puzzlement and doubt are, however, already crimes in the totalitarian state. The mind that is open for questions is open for dissent. In the totalitarian regime, the doubting, inquisitive, and imaginative mind has to be suppressed. The totalitarian slave is only allowed to memorize, to salivate when the bell rings. It is not my task here to elaborate on the subject of the biased use of Pavlovian rules by totalitarians. But without doubt, part of the interpretation of any psychology is determined by the ways we think about our fellow human beings and man's place in nature. If our ideal is to make conditioned zombies out of people, the current misuse of Pavlovianism will serve our purpose. But once we become even vaguely aware that in the totalitarian picture of man, the characteristic human note is missing, and when we see that in such a scheme, man sacrifices his instinctual desires, his pleasures, his aims, his goals, his creativity, his instinct for freedom, his paradoxicality, we immediately turn against this political perversion of science. Such use of Pavlovian technique is aimed only at developing the automaton in man, not his free, alert mind that is aware of moral goals and aims in life. Even in laboratory animals, we have found that effective goal-directedness can spoil the Pavlovian experiment. When, during a bell food training session, the dog's beloved master entered the room, the animal lost all its previous conditioning and began to bark excitedly. Here's an example of an age-old truth. Love and laughter break through all rigid conditioning. The rigid automaton cannot exist without spontaneous self-expression. Apparently, the fact the dog's spontaneous affection for his master could ruin all the mechanical calculations and manipulations never occurred to Pavlov's totalitarian students.
And that was The Rape of the Mind, The Urge to Be Conditioned. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, 30 covert emotional manipulation tactics, picking up where we left off yesterday.
5. Premature disclosure. Using this tactic, manipulators reveal intimate information about themselves early on to create a false sense of intimacy for the purpose of gaining your trust. The manipulator's self-disclosure can include their thoughts, feelings, goals, fears, dreams, embarrassments, likes and dislikes, and successes and failures. You'll feel free to disclose things about yourself in return. Self-revelation involves vulnerability because of the risk of rejection. But when the disclosure is met with acceptance and understanding, it creates emotional intimacy and trust. This is especially so when the manipulator says she feels the same way you do, that she likes the same things, or that she had the very same thing happen to her. There is also the opportunity to impress the target by disclosing achievements and philanthropic or compassionate acts. Manipulators count on this normal bonding behavior to work in their favor. 6. Triangulation. Never let the other person use absence or create pain and conflict to keep you, the seduced, on tenterhooks. Robert Greene, The Art of Seduction. Triangulation is a devious and effective tactic in a manipulator's arsenal. The manipulator creates a triangle between you, him, or her, and some third person outside of your relationship. It is intended to make you feel insecure about the relationship, and therefore more eager to please the manipulator in order to keep him or her around. The manipulator will figuratively or literally bring another man or woman into the relationship in some way. They might talk casually and frequently about an old flame, a coworker, or someone they bump into regularly on their morning coffee run. Or they might obviously flirt with someone in front of you. Their interest in the other person creates insecurity. If they make subtle, unfavorable comparisons between you and the outside person, which they're apt to do, that makes it much worse. If you confront them, they will deny interest in the other person and tell you that the real problem is your insecurity or low self-esteem. Where have you heard that before? It is not uncommon for the manipulator to be grooming the other person as his or her next target, while conveniently using that person to devalue and manipulate you at the same time. For example, the manipulator might flirt with another woman in front of you, so he can build his relationship with her while causing you to behave jealously, which can then be used as the reason to end your relationship. In a healthy relationship, you will know where you stand with your partner. A manipulator creates an ongoing sense of uncertainty, which leads to ongoing emotional angst.
And that was two more of the covert emotional manipulation tactics. And again, this is a book you want to listen to in terms of politics. So when the jealousy part comes with the left always invoking independence. Oh, you Republicans, you better not do that because you're going to irritate the independents. You're not going to get the independent vote. And so all this constant worry about the independents. And then the left always does produces this false sense of intimacy. You can tell a lefty very often when they first open their mouths by what they talk about. They will come out and say things that are almost embarrassingly personal, very personal details about their lives. You might be at the bookstore or at the library looking at something, and they'll just casually walk up and start talking to you as if they've known you their whole life. And it's very awkward, and it's very it creates a lot of tension. And again, the idea is to manipulate you, to get you to give up your privacy. And the more often that you give up your privacy, the less you can consider your privacy as a right, and the more socialized you become. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now Chapter 2 of The Gospel According to Breaking Bad.
Chapter 2. Say my name. Here's a note. I like name tags, so on the book I have a picture of, hello, my name is Mr. White. So there you go. You're Heisenberg. For good or ill, names define us. We can refuse to carry the mantle that accompanies our name, or we can strive as valiantly as possible to live up to the name given us. While some may never give second thought to the meaning behind their name, writers often give careful consideration to their characters' names. After all, it's a person they'll have to live with for a long time. By delving into the meaning and origin of the names encountered in Breaking Bad, we can learn much about who these people are, who they might become, and who they were all along. Gilligan and his talented crew of writers couldn't have been more blatant in their intentions to have the audience emotionally identify with Breaking Bad's protagonist. By christening Walter with the last name of White, we're predisposed to a myriad of notions when it comes to his identity. He's a blank canvas, allowing us to paint our own issues into his world. He's an everyman, necessary but inconsequential. He's a decent man, working as hard as he can to provide for his family. What's the first word that comes to mind when you think white? For me, as a kid, sure to be at church nearly every weekend, singing hymns that proclaim Jesus' ability to make me white as snow, the word pure springs to mind. Unblemished and untarnished, the word white connotes goodness, wholeness, and holiness, a word that means set apart. By supplying Walter with such a sterling surname, we may be subconsciously acquiescing to Walter's perceived inherent goodness. While the vast majority of us can't relate to the utterly unique opening sequence of the pilot episode, its subsequent scenes may be all too familiar. Exercising at home, breakfast with the family, dropping a kid off at school, tolerating a day job, enduring a second job to make ends meet, attending a surprise birthday party, cautiously expecting a baby. One of the most gripping aspects of this show is in its portrayal of the absurd amongst the mundane. The domestic scenes keep the plot grounded in real life, while simultaneously coercing us to identify with Walter White. We know him because we are him, or, at the very least, we know someone who could easily be him. Gilligan also liked the name Walter White because of the alliterative sound of it, and because it's strangely bland, yet sticks in your head nonetheless. You know, white is the color of vanilla, of blandness. In other words, he wanted to portray an everyman who's more likely to blend into the background than to be the center of attention. Despite its blandness, the name sticks inside your mind. Walter White has become one of the most well-known characters in recent TV history. Why is that? Before even knowing his story, and whether we're aware of the way his simple name has worked its way into our minds, we've likely already formed a positive opinion of Walter. When we learn of his cancer, his pregnant wife, and his son that endures cerebral palsy, we're forcibly shoved over the precipice of non-involvement with this seemingly timid chemistry teacher. We begin to root for him, at least until we discover that Walter White may be one of the most impure men ever depicted on TV. Then again, if we knew our German a little better, we would know where Walter is leading us. From the German Wald for rule and Harry for army, Walter means ruler of the army. As we're well aware of by season 5, Walter commands his own army through creative, intelligent, devious manipulations. In Walter's mind, he quite lives up to his name, a pure ruler. The preseason ad for season 5 admits as much, as we see hazmat-suited Walter perched on a lawn chair, mountains of meth behind him, a cascade of cash beside him, with the simple phrase, "All hail the king," floating like a thought bubble above his unmistakable shaven dome. He's never able to admit as much within the show, but those 4 words tell us much about his inner psyche. If the game is no longer to provide for his family, which it wasn't after season 1, then the game now is to have every last person bow down to the almighty power of his intellect. Walter White can say that he wants to be king. He can't voice that he wants to be God. Even though Walter may, in fact, live up to his given name, he still feels the need to call himself by another name, a more mysterious name, in order to assert himself in the business of making meth. You know this name. He's the one who knocks. Like a snug pork pie hat, hiding beneath the Heisenberg name fits Walter on every side. In a telling similarity, the real Heisenberg won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1932 for his work in quantum mechanics. As you may recall, Walter once contributed research to a team that eventually won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, as evidenced by a prized plaque in his house, briefly seen in the pilot episode. Walter's endless need for respect even filters into his choice of a rather ridiculous alias for himself. If he can't retain the respect of his professional peers in the scientific world, he's going to do as much as he can to earn the respect of his peers in the drug world. In time, Heisenberg becomes a mysterious, fearsome name, known for a high-quality product and a low tolerance for disobedience. In ways reminiscent of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Fight Club, Walter becomes Heisenberg, even when he doesn't have to be Heisenberg. Bryan Cranston said as much. I wanted to create a sensibility that as long as he didn't recognize the man in the mirror, he could almost justify his actions, like Jekyll and Hyde. Though we're given a literal front row seat to his devolution throughout the series, Walter's total transformation into Heisenberg most notably occurs when he decides to continue shaving his head despite his cancer's remission. This is a not-so-subtle wink and a nod from the series' creators to let us know that, more often than not, Heisenberg is the man in charge of Walter White. There was a moment nobody ever really wrote about in the first or second season, when he was in remission from his cancer, and he decided, even though his hair was growing back, he decided to shave his head some more. And that was a big thing for me because it made a statement that he was truly accepting this new life of his. Cranston also related a subtle visual cue for Walter's full metamorphosis into Heisenberg. We didn't have Walt stand erect until he became Heisenberg. Walter adroitly adopts a mystical moniker from the 20th century German theoretical physicist Werner Heisenberg, known most for his discovery of the uncertainty principle. The more precisely the position is determined, the less precisely the momentum is known in this instant, and vice versa. Though a complex notion, this is the uncertainty principle in its simplest form, defined by the original Heisenberg in 1927. As a way of understanding Breaking Bad, it's a key to Walter White's errant beliefs about himself. Through a vastly superior intellect when compared to those around him, Walter can precisely determine his position in any situation and plan for most contingencies. However, Walter is blind to the momentum, the consequences of his actions. Contrarily, if he knew the momentum of his actions, if he could see how every last one of his reprehensible choices could lead to his family's demise, he would, we hope, alter his course accordingly. Sadly, according to his eponymous physicist predecessor, you can only know position or momentum. It's impossible to know both simultaneously. Walter chooses to know his position at every turn, ensuring that he stays in control of his world at all times, ignorant of his increasingly deadly momentum. To some, the physicist Heisenberg decried causality in nature, that is, that every action has a predictable outcome if all the data about the action is known beforehand. Ironically, this is the mental world that our drug-dealing Heisenberg inhabits. He believes he can tell the future by rightly assessing every fact of the present.
And that was the Gospel According to Breaking Bad. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now it's about 5 minutes or so with Tucker-Carlson, and he's talking about some questions that he posed to Republican presidential candidates about the war in Ukraine. So we got that, a little bit of his commentary, and then I've got some commentary of my own at the end.
Last week, we sent a questionnaire to every Republican presidential candidate, announced and potential, asking about Ukraine. We posed 6 questions. Is opposing Russia in Ukraine a vital strategic interest for America? What's our objective in Ukraine, and how are we going to know when we've achieved it? What is the limit of money and weapons you'd be willing to send to Zelensky? Have U.S. sanctions been effective? And does the United States face the risk of nuclear war with Russia? It's kind of presumptuous for a cable show to send these, but no one else in the media seemed to be asking them, and we thought we should. The first presidential primaries are 10 months away. Voters should know where their candidates stand on the big issues, and this in some ways is the biggest issue. So tonight we're happy to report that virtually everyone we asked responded. Nikki Haley ignored us. John Bolton said he was too busy doing some unspecified thing. But most of the rest of them did get back to us, and we are grateful that they did. In general, the answers were fascinating. Some of them were so thoughtful and so smart, they give you hope for the Republican Party. With only a few exceptions, their answers bore no resemblance at all to the statements you see every day from Mitch McConnell and various Republican committee chairmen in the Congress. Republicans in Washington tend to be committed neocons in the Hillary Clinton mold. But Republicans running for president this cycle generally are not at all. That was a surprise, a refreshing surprise. We had no idea. We didn't know what to think. So we're going to post every response that we got in full on our Twitter account tonight as a public record of where the candidates stand on Ukraine. We hope you will look at them. But first, here's a quick summary of what we received. So former President Donald Trump, who as of tonight is the front runner for the Republican nomination, sent a long and really interesting response. Russia would never have attacked Ukraine if I were president, he writes, not even a small chance. Trump says he opposes regime change in Russia. Quote, we should support regime change in the United States. That's far more important. The Biden administration are the ones who got us into this mess. Trump repeatedly refers to the risk of nuclear war, which he describes as absolutely real, and then he calls for a negotiated peace by Ukraine mediated by the United States. Quote, both sides are weary and ready to make a deal, Trump writes. The meeting should start immediately. There is no time to spare. Death and destruction must end now. Trump has been saying things like this and predicting this for 5 years now, and he's saying it again. What's interesting, though, is that Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence, who was also running for president this year, opposes his old boss on nearly every point. We're paying the Ukrainians to fight Russia, Pence writes, so we won't have to fight Russians ourselves. Pence endorses even stricter sanctions against Moscow. He dismisses the risk of nuclear war as a, quote, bullying tactic from Putin. And then Pence suggests that anyone who disagrees with his views on Ukraine is a disloyal American. Quote, there is no room for Putin apologists in the Republican Party. Mike Pence did not specify who he was talking about, though we suspect this show is included in that treasonous category. And then maybe the most newsworthy response that we received was from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. DeSantis has well-known views on many topics, of course, but until tonight, no one could really say with precision where he stood on the war in Ukraine, which is arguably the most important topic in the world. And now we know. DeSantis is adamantly opposed to the position that most Republicans in Washington have taken on Ukraine. DeSantis is not a neocon. Who knew? Quote, while the U.S. has many vital national interests, DeSantis writes, securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness within our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. Without question, he writes, peace should be the objective. The U.S. should not provide assistance that could require the deployment of American troops or enable Ukraine to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders. F-16s and long-range missiles should therefore be off the table. These moves would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict and drawing us closer to a hot war between the world's two largest nuclear powers. That risk is unacceptable. DeSantis goes on to oppose the policy of regime change in Moscow, which is very popular in Washington, and he points out that the Biden administration has created an alliance between Russia and China, and that's a disaster for the United States. Quote, "We cannot prioritize intervention in an escalating foreign war over the defense of our own homeland, especially as tens of thousands of Americans are dying every year from narcotics smuggled across our open border, and our weapons arsenals, critically for our own security, are rapidly being depleted." So that's DeSantis' position, clarified. Vivek Ramaswamy, meanwhile, who you just saw, who announced for president on this show a few weeks back, responded with what was effectively an essay. It was so tightly argued and sharp, it probably should be a Wall Street Journal piece. We hope it becomes one. We can't really do it justice here, but a few short excerpts give you the flavor. Quote, "China wants the Ukraine war to last as long as possible to deplete Western military capacity before invading Taiwan. It's working. We think we appear stronger by helping Ukraine, but actually become weaker vis-a-vis China. We've spent 20 years droning people in caves in the Middle East and Central Asia and have little to show for it. We should be taking out the people who have caused the deaths of more than 100,000 Americans every year, the Mexican drug cartels. If I were president right now, I would limit any further funding or support to Ukraine. Ukraine is not in the top 5 of American foreign policy priorities right now, and yet merely questioning whether the money we spent on the war is being done effectively or perhaps even prolonging the war is seen as disloyal. We get accused by both Democrats and Republicans of being, quote, Putin sympathizers. The Washington Uniparty and defense contractors want this conflict to go on forever. For the sake of the global economy and peace, we should be doing everything we can to end it tomorrow." End quote. Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota echoed some of these points. "The primary external threat to the United States is communist China," she writes. And then she added another point that you rarely hear and not often enough. Quote, "The United States has come to rely far too heavily on financial sanctions as a weapon of deterrence. Now the nations that hate America are consciously moving away from the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Sanctions against China, Iran, and Russia have bolstered the Russian ruble and enabled China to establish trade in Chinese money rather than in U.S. dollars." That is true, provably true. And you wonder why so few in Congress, which passed these sanctions, will acknowledge it. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, meanwhile, was not quite so bold or precise, but in spirit, he seemed to agree with most of the rest of the Republican candidates. Quote, "President Biden's blank check foreign policy in Ukraine has diverted funding from essential needs in the United States. Throwing money at Ukraine with no accountability or objective is clearly failing." End quote. Once again, we had no idea the candidates felt this way until today, and we're glad they do. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, by the way, did not send a statement, but instead a transcript from a hit he did on Trey Gowdy's weekend show here on Fox. Not many details in it, but Scott did call for, quote, degrading the Russian military. He did not explain what the point of that might be. And finally, Chris Christie is still around and still full of bombast, still a sporty character. In fact, if anything, Christie seems to become even more orthodox as a neocon. He calls on the U.S. military to fight and win a war against both Russia and China simultaneously. Otherwise, he warns, Iran and North Korea could take over the world. So that is where the Republican presidential candidates stand on Ukraine, but do not.
So again, that was Tucker Carlson about, close to 8 minutes on the different candidates and where they stand on Ukraine. Now, the fact that he's got to ask these questions tells you everything you need to know about the situation we're in vis-a-vis Ukraine, that we're in Ukraine, we're sending, and not in it in terms of actual boots on the ground, but that we're involved in terms of sending money and sending material to Ukraine because we've been bullied into it. And the example, the perfect example is former Vice President Mike Pence, and it shocks me to hear him say that there's no room for any Putin apologists in the Republican Party. But that's the whole reason we're in it, because nobody politically, right or left, wants, and this is why both the Democrats and the Republicans are united in sending money and aid to Ukraine, because nobody in America wants to be seen as a, quote, Putin apologist, unquote. They've been psychologically bullied and intimidated into going along with this. Now, they also think, for whatever reason, that they are, well, for reasons that go back long time, decades, that they're leaders. They think of themselves as leaders. Mitch McConnell's a leader, and technically he is. He's a leader of the Republicans in the Senate, but that's as far as it goes. But he thinks of himself as a leader of the United States, of the entire government, or not government, but people of the United States. One of the leaders. President of the United States is a leader. And they're not. They're either servants or they're representatives. In the case of Mitch McConnell, he is a representative, and he represents not the entire United States, he represents Kentucky. Okay, so does Rand Paul. But anyways, they're representatives, and that may seem like a rather obvious detail, but they're not acting that way. They should be. What they should be doing is, if they believe as individuals that we should supply arms and munitions and whatnot to Ukraine, they should be going to the American people and making the case. So what would be a case for going to war? Because again, peace is always the status quo. War is an exception to the status quo. It's a change in the status quo. We weren't sending arms to Ukraine 10 years ago, and we weren't involved in any conflicts between Ukraine and Russia 10 years ago. Okay, so minding our own business was the status quo, peace was the status quo, and now we find ourselves in the middle of a war, just like that. So what would be a prima facie case for change? Treaties. That if we had first of all, if Ukraine was part of NATO and Russia attacked Ukraine, now we have a prima facie case for change, because NATO, the part of the contract in NATO, says an attack on one is an attack on all. So we would become involved, and so would the other NATO nations. We would all be involved either directly or indirectly in ejecting Russia from Ukraine. Another way is to have a separate peace treaty or some type of a defense treaty with Ukraine, in which the United States agrees to go ahead and come to their aid should they be invaded by anybody, or maybe more specifically if they get invaded by Russia. But absent that, there is no case for sending troops without some type without the agreement of the American people. Okay, if they want to make the case, this is an extraordinary situation, we didn't have time, or whatever reason we didn't get a treaty, a defense treaty with Ukraine, but we still need to then make the case. Come out to the American people, make the case, get us to agree to it, and once that happens, then we get involved. But that's not the way it's been going with a lot of things, but especially this war, where it is our representatives, the people we vote to represent us, have taken it upon themselves to decide all by themselves what it is that we should do vis-a-vis Ukraine. It's wrong, and it should stop immediately. Back in a minute. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So I'm reminding you that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.